I'm going to hit show my screen. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our third Craic meeting with our special guest, David Kaczynski. And before we get started, I'd like to do just a little bit of housekeeping with everybody. If you need to contact us during the course of our hour together, if you're having any tech problems or any questions, I'm going to ask you to use your question box on your webinar control panel. So if any questions or any problems, just use your question box on your webinar control panel. You'll be able to, through the course of the webinar, you will hear three of us. You will hear me, Patricia Fennell, my guest, Dave Kaczynski. David, say hi.
Hi.
And Vicki, my right-hand essential person as my navigator. Vic, say hi to the folks.
Good morning, everyone.
And so, again, welcome. We are really happy to have Dave with us today to talk about creativity and chronic experience and trauma and illness, and how he's used the idiom of poetry. He has a new book out where he has written extensively about a lot of his experiences. I'm going to let me put Dave's bio up here, and can everybody hopefully see ours here on Dave?
Pat, your screen is not changing, so you may want to hit that little arrow button.
The arrow button.
My.
I'm sorry?
Above show my screen, as we did the other day.
Yep. Okay.
There we go.
Okay, let me just back this up a little bit.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. So anyway, here's a little bit of information about Dave and his new book, A Dream Named You. And Dave started this in the months after his brother Ted, who's been named the Unabomber, was captured by the FBI. And Dave was really using this whole format and idiom of poetry as a way to make sense of all that was going on internally, externally, all that kind of experience. So before we have an opportunity to talk with Dave, what I'd like to do with folks is just go through some thoughts about improvisation, creation, and innovation, something that comes out of this experience of suffering. How we can use improvisation and the arts and the tools of the arts to help us make sense out of the different kinds of experiences in our lives. For those who have been to our webinars before, part of what folks have shared with me is that when they hear this material, they hear something different every time. And I'll be curious, Dave, after I go through this, what some of the thoughts that you may have. So one of the things I want to share with folks is this whole concept of innovation and creation, that when we use the tools of improvisation, it leads to creation, and that in turn leads to innovation. And these are really useful ideas when we think about them in the context of change, because change is the one thing in our lives, no matter what our experiences are, that is absolutely inevitable. It can be good, it can be bad, but it will come. And improvisation, leading to creation and thus to innovation, really helps us respond to change in the most productive and potentially positive way. Now, I would argue, and others would too, that creation is an extremely powerful stance against helplessness. And helplessness is often what we feel in the face of chronic illness, trauma, violence, change. It's a very powerful argument, but it requires active reflection and creative action. So it requires active reflection on who we are and what we're doing, and creative action, and it must be authentic. Authenticity is really important. Now here's some of what I mean by authenticity. A lot of people have put effort into defining authenticity, and I think it's something to take a look at and think about in your own lives. In the process of creation, for me, it's absolutely necessary to maintain insight about my limitations and my abilities. So from this regard, your limitations and your abilities. This is not easy. Reflecting on that is often painful. It's necessary, though, to consistently strive for this, because the more I know what I can do and what I can't do, the more likely it is that I can really bring all of myself to the creative process. One of my favorite quotes here from one of my favorite founding fathers is, "The price of freedom is eternal vigilance." We need to know. Now I'm going to share with you 5 capacities of improvisation that I think are really essential in helping us be creative, taking difficult times, responding to change, that help us then lead to innovation. So one thought is to allow people with chronic conditions, chronic illnesses, to establish acceptance and meaning in their changed circumstances. The 5 capacities help us do that. And your particular discipline, whether it's writing, poetry, painting, music, your particular personality or circumstance may mean other capacities are required other than the 5 that I outline here today. Don't limit yourself to these sets. Whatever they are, discover and define them. Now, well, the first one I want to put out to you to think about is to tolerate ambiguity. This is a tough one. This is one that I struggle with, that I always think about, use, and something I have to reflect on just about a daily basis. Ambiguity is unavoidable. We ongoingly need to learn how to survive the not knowing. We need to take the time to be uncomfortable to get to know where we need to be. In doing this, we learn how to do the emotional heavy lifting, and speaking for myself, this sometimes leads to wisdom. And in this regard, wisdom is appreciating the value of the unknown. And this realization is something good will come if I allow this ambiguity, if I learn how to be with it. Secondly, the next capacity is becoming curious. Change is an opportunity, and within the context of change, curiosity can lead to innovation and change, positive change. Our culture sometimes squelches a child's curiosity, for that matter in adults too, wonder and risk-taking. Our culture's toleration of curiosity is influenced by your gender, your race, your social class. Curiosity can have positive connotations, childlike wonder, or negative ones. Maybe curiosity is being nosy. Curiosity killed the cat. Often ambiguous ones about questioning authority. Third capacity, learning how to take risks. I take the risk of getting started every day, and I think a lot of us do, putting the feet on the floor. Now, I think there are conscious versus unconscious modes of risk-taking, and I think of unconscious risk-taking as being impulsive risk-taking. I'm a firm believer in calculated risk-taking. I like risk-taking that's informed by knowledge of limits and abilities, that isn't particularly impulsive. Not that it's not bad to be impulsive once in a while, but not as a general way to operate with risk. If we use calculated risk-taking, it minimizes shame, it minimizes embarrassment, and it minimizes fear of failure. And in calculated risk-taking, we have an exit strategy if things don't go as planned. You can't always have an exit strategy, but that's something to really sort of strive for. So I think risk-taking is really important, and it's important to think through how you're going to do it. Fourth capacity, improvisation. Improvisation requires that we make a choice. The statement or the choice of the moment. Is it a word? Is it a phrase? Is it picking up the paintbrush? I'm a musician. When I'm on the bandstand, what do I choose to do next? Either in response to myself, or my fellow musicians. And then there's a reaction to that, either internally in me or in them, and then a reaction to the reaction, and on it goes. Choosing in the moment. Do you pick up the paintbrush? What color will you use? And one of the things in improvisation where I find that people get stuck often is they're waiting for the aha moment. They're waiting for the light bulb. I don't think you need to. I think it comes very rarely. If it does come, that's wonderful, but it's really not necessary. Fifth capacity, the innovation piece. Okay, you've taken some risks, you've been curious, you've made some choices, and this leads to innovation. And then there's a result out of this. Maybe it's an idea, a paragraph, a picture, a line, a part of a song. Doesn't matter if it's small or large, that's a victory. That is a victory. It's very important for us to ask for outside help, to be mentored, to get training, instruction, assistance, and if in the process of reflection, to accommodate whatever our limits are and whatever our abilities and talents are. So Vic, yeah. I think it's probably time to launch a poll for the folks.
Okay.
And find out, give some thought to which of the 5 capacities do you think is your strongest capacity? Do you tolerate ambiguity well? Do you allow yourself to be curious? Are you a good risk taker? Just some thoughts on that. And while Vic's doing that for a minute or two, Dave, of what I just shared there, is there anything in those capacities that I just shared that resonates for you today?
Well, a lot resonates. I think the one that really jumps out at me the most is the toleration of ambiguity. I mean, I think that's a strong capacity for me, and it's interesting because I've always, I think, resisted a little bit any kind of black and white description of the world, and after obviously my brother was arrested and my life changed, and my self-questioning was stimulated by what does all this mean? What role did I play? Did I do the right thing? Did I do the wrong thing in turning in my brother? I saw relationships change around me. People treated me differently. I had the media kind of camped out around our house, insisting that they get answers that I didn't even have for myself.
Right, right.
And so I think my tolerance of ambiguity was even challenged, because here I'm not sure who I am, certainly who my brother is, or about any of the relationships or sort of plans I'd made that I had taken for granted.
If I can piggyback on that, I think the easiest one for me is curiosity. I think it has served me well, but maybe gotten me in trouble here and there because I'm endlessly curious. But the one that seems to be the most important, I agree, is tolerating ambiguity. It's something that I've struggled with, and when I allow myself to think about it and I allow myself to be with it and learn about what gee, I don't know, and can I just allow myself to not know and have just to allow the process to see what happens next seems to often lead to a better place. I may not like it, it may be very uncomfortable, but it does take a lot of effort on my part to learn how to do it. Hopefully I'm getting better at it after all these years. Vic, any information on the poll questions?
Yeah, let me go ahead and close that unless I think there's one person who has not voted, but maybe that person is electing not to. So okay. I'm going to go ahead and close that right now. And 3/4 of our folks did vote, and everyone chose become curious.
Now that's really interesting that today that's a piece of what people are really interesting about. Well, folks, hold that thought about curiosity as David and I are speaking. And so, Dave, let's tell me a little bit about the book. Tell me what got you to this, and what really spawned it. And yeah, tell me something about this book.
Sure. The book is dedicated to my wife, Linda, and to me, a very important piece of being creative has to do with relationship. And I sometimes talk about Linda as my muse. We met in the 7th grade, and I fell in love with her when I was 16, and she fell back in love with me when she was like 39. So, needless to say, it was a long courtship. But I was finally able to convince her that I was good husband material. And so there's this sort of background of trust and joy and intuition. And of course, Linda had played an important part in the change that came into both of our lives, because it was her intuition that really first grasped the possibility that my brother Ted might be the Unabomber. And of course, that faced us.
That's right. That's right.
Faced us with this awful dilemma, and I still sometimes scratch my head and wonder about that. How was it possible? I mean, she had never actually met my brother because of his estrangement from the family and the way he lived, and yet Linda, not me, was the one who was able to make the connection. I actually began writing poetry about 2 months after my brother was arrested, and that was certainly a traumatic time for our family, at least in the sense that there was a tremendous amount of imposed change, and it felt awfully negative and kind of made me question everything. And I was in a tough place because there was such interest from the media of, why did you turn in your brother? Who is your brother? What is your family like? Questions that I really didn't want to answer, or at least answer very, very carefully. So I was, kind of caught in this strange place where the media, at least, and many people kind of wanted to know a lot about me, and I wanted to hide. I wanted to protect what privacy I had left and gain some time to think.
Just what to comment about that is it strikes me that you had to now cope with this huge outer public world while you were trying to cope with and make sense of all of these really potent changes in your internal world, painful changes. And I think that's something that folks who have either been suffered loss through illness or death, or certainly trauma and loss through whether it's an injustice of some sort, that they now have this experience of this sort of split between this outer world and this inner world. And I think for you, my impression at least is it was almost on an iconic Greek level, where it's very public and very large, and then what you were having to deal with internally was so large and significant as well.
Yeah, I think you've really described kind of like where I felt, and one thing that was beginning to dawn on me at that time is that I really couldn't rewind the clock. I couldn't change anything my brother had done or any of the choices I had made. But the one thing that I could do was maybe try to find some meaning in it, or search for meaning in it, or ask questions about it, and not accept kind of easy definitions. Here's where the tolerance for ambiguity comes, but kind of search into myself for a pathway forward, which hopefully would be meaningful in some sense.
Well, Dave, let me add, would this be a good time to ask you to possibly, if you wouldn't mind, reading one of the poems from the book?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me to do that. I could read one, and this is written, I guess, at a point when I realized my brother is in prison, as a man who had loved the wilderness, the out-of-doors, the freedom of the out-of-doors, and that he was probably going to stay there for the rest of his life. And so the poem is entitled Hard Time, and of course that's what we talk about in terms of incarceration is hard time. But I also try to use it as a metaphor and an analogy to the prisons that we're all in, or sometimes feel that we're in,
Yes.
And so hopefully it has, it goes beyond the experience of incarceration or how I imagine that to something that would resonate more widely. But let me give it a try here.
Okay, good.
Hard time. Even in a concrete cell, space has no center, no edge. Ego melts. The forbidden outside world reveals itself no differently than anyone's imagined future. Personalized, haunted, false. Every undesirable attitude I ascribed to others was mine in the beginning. The irrevocable commitment of thoughts, beliefs, clumsy frame, a mnemonic bolt of regret. Some people depend too much, are never free. My only visitors are the ones I failed.
Wow.
Well, that's it. And it's sort of, I felt a kind of identification with Ted in some sense. As I was writing that poem, I felt like I was doing hard time myself in a metaphorical way while he was doing literal hard time.
And one of the things that has come up for me in some of my thinking and writing and talking about patients and what folks are experiencing as either traumatized folks, chronically ill folks, or both, is I found that some of the best material for people to understand, particularly if they were housebound, if they were bedbound, is that this was its own kind of incarceration, that it was its own kind of, was it a prison? Was the body a prison? Was the psyche a prison? Or wasn't it? And I found that reading, encouraging folks to read about, say, Mandela's time in prison was helpful. And I also often heard from people that this was, that being confined, the experience of confinement was often a time of profound regret. And what had they done wrong? Had they done anything wrong? Is that how they ended up in this state, in this place? I liked what you said before. I love the poem. I think it captures it. I love the pneumatic bolt. I think that was one of the words that, a couple of the words that you might have used there. And one of my patients talked about everybody having their own internal gulag, and how did they transcend that, or could they transcend that? I think that really, thank you. I think that really captures it. And I had another thought I wanted to ask you about, something that came out of another question, that when violence occurs in the world, and I think, as we know, that how your brother ended up incarcerated was because of violent acts. And one of the things I've heard you say very articulately, talk about, is no matter how quickly violence occurs, whether or not thought is put into the violent act, and often violence is extremely rapid, the process of rebuilding and developing a healing response is really lengthy compared to the rapidity with which violence can occur. And that makes me think about your process of poetry, how that takes time. How do those pieces fit for you? How do those thoughts fit for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when one has been close to violence or witnessed violence or been impacted by it, it suddenly dawns so clearly that it is so easy to hurt and destroy. It can be done mindlessly, and usually is done mindlessly, and yet it's such a long time, such hard work to build and create. And I think that's the tragedy of life. It's easy to destroy, hard to create, and creation takes time. It takes patience, and I think a deep level of trust. I mean, I think learning and allowing oneself to be creative after a trauma is a way of recovering trust, at least trust in oneself and one's own processes. So I think what you said really makes a lot of sense to me, and certainly fits with my own experience. And the process of writing poems helped me to feel, gee, for all of this awful stuff that I've been experiencing and that people have said, and the sense of disconnection I'm feeling simply because nobody else has gone through what I'm going through at this moment. There is a resilience, a kind of sort of creative spring if you're just patient and watchful and try to cultivate it.
And I think trust is a really fine word there, that in the creative process, in that experience, I think you nailed it. This trust begins to occur in that process. If those, for me at least, if those capacities are present, then something happens. And in that something happening, sometimes it's a, oh, I like that. Sometimes it's, I'm not sure. But this element of trust begins to occur. And I think one of the things in the creative process that really gets provoked or changed, and when we think about the creative process as once again requiring us to tolerate ambiguity and the unknown, is it, for me, it moves me out of the black and white choice. When I have to try, when I try to be creative, when I'm going to allow, make some space for that. And for me, it's more of it can be writing, but let's say it's more of a music experience. I don't necessarily, it's not black or white, it's not one or the other. And I have to kind of sit in the ambiguity and see what happens next. I have to trust that, and it's uncomfortable, but it forces me to allow the gray. Does that make sense?
It sure does. And I would also add to that though we think of some forms of artistic creation as solitary activities, that it also moved you out of isolation. I think trauma is isolating, and
very.
One of the ways in which we sort of reintegrate inwardly and externally is through relationship. And my experience was no exception, because it was actually a friend who had invited me to come to a poetry group, a group of, small group of writers who met monthly to just, and I said, well, I'm not a poet. And he said, well, just come and listen. And of course, the second time I brought a poem. And so there was a kind of risk-taking in sharing, one's child, I guess, one's artistic creation within a context of people who celebrate that process and who are going to be, give you constructive feedback and criticism, but at the same time, receptively opening themselves to what you're doing as well. So for me, it was the community of the poets that made a great deal of difference to me as well.
You touched on several things there that you said the person invited you, and you said, well, I'm not a poet. And a lot of what I hear from folks is, well, I'm not a painter, I'm not a writer, I'm not a musician, I am not that thing. And part of how I use the capacities with folks, with myself, is to say, well, you don't have to be whatever we think that is. Just part of it is allowing yourself to be curious and see what happens next. And I think that whole concept of community, of how community allows that kind of expression and that possibility for feedback and that possibility for help, for support, for change. And I'm speaking for myself, that it's in that context of community that I really see movement happen. I really see change happen. One other thought about that is, and I was having a discussion with a patient the other night. This lovely person is their spouse is dying and will probably be gone pretty soon. And part of what we're talking about is we experience our trauma, we experience our loss very personally, it's very isolating, and we can often feel like we are the only person who is going through that experience or at that level of experience. And so on the one hand, this experience of suffering is very individual, it is very isolating, yet the truth is many people experience all kinds of, it's part of life. And when we go into community, we find that out. We find that out when we seek others of like kind. So you were invited in, you found other poets, and you found a place, a community. What do you think?
Yeah, and of course it met my other need because the media wasn't there.
Right.
I could just speak freely, and people would listen, and that's part of the process of sharing and critiquing and admiring each other's poetry. So
yeah. One of the things I write about is these within the 4 phases. The first one being the crisis phase, the second one stabilization, the third resolution. And in resolution, we talk about creative process, which is what we're doing today, coming out of the third phase. But in the second phase, which is about where you were, is where we do seek others of like kind. And whether it's, kids in South Central looking for gangs, which may or may not be the best other of like kind, but we will search for it. We will crave that. And sometimes they come looking for us, and fortunately, this friend said, "Hey, come and be with us." And that experience of community can really be hugely transforming, very transforming. And I think the process of one of the things I think is hard for folks is to recognize in their own suffering that there are others out there, that we are not alone, and it's very tough to remember that in the midst of our own suffering, I think. So, a thought about that.
Yeah, through the act of creation, we're exploring ourselves and connecting with others. So it's integration
Exactly.
Inwardly and outwardly at the same
Outwardly.
time.
It helps us and it helps them. Dave, let me ask you to, would you read another poem for us?
I'll give you, yeah, and a lot of my poem, I'm asking from my readers a lot of tolerance of ambiguity because I love it when words mean different things, like, this sort of hard time. And this next poem is called, I suppose you would say a more hopeful poem called The Next Life. And I could be talking about reincarnation, rebirth, or I just could be talking about the life beyond sort of the moment,
right.
The place we're moving to. So, but this is also talking about my love for Linda as well and our relationship, and contemplating the end of it all too, death. I think when something really stops us in our tracks, there is that sense of what is the limit of all this? What does it all mean? And then death is kind of out there as some kind of a framework for at least for the way I think about things. Anyway, The Next Life.
Right.
Any separation could be our last moment together on earth. Perhaps you'll find me again by some indications in a child. Our connection like a broken pipe, gushing love upon the ground, creating a sweet space close by, an impromptu garden of wildflowers, invoking clouds of gnats one day, clustered butterflies the next. In our dark bed, colors flow and envelop you. Perhaps we'll be together in sleep, the vast inner universe rendered boundless through compassion, the unsuspecting child ours. Pray she'll hold the garden in her heart when hurts and fears arise, inherit our joy, not our pain, blend wisdom with innocence, and let suffering end with us.
That's beautiful. One of the things that's lovely about that, which you really sort of captured, I mean, I hear it in it, and as you described it before you read it, is that that next life can be afterlife. It can be what's going to come in the next chapter of our lives, and it can be this afternoon.
Or it could be our children, you know.
And it could
they're
be
the next
exactly
life.
that. They're the next life, you know, our legacy.
Yeah.
Our legacy. I wanted to ask you if you would mind if I read one of your poems.
Oh, I'd be honored.
And what's part of what's lovely about this, and I think is part of what's wonderful about poetry, is that I haven't discussed this poem with you ahead of time. As I said to you just before we started the webinar, I got your book. When I picked it up, I was compelled to read it cover to cover. I read poetry. I read a lot of poets, and I thought, wow. And this one spoke to me, and so here it is. And then maybe we can discuss it for a moment afterwards. It's entitled Ode to Obscurity. Strange bird calling loudly outside my friend's vacant house. Inside, the telephone rings incessantly. Hello? Goodbye. After the first time, I resolve not to answer. I work up a sweat, clearing out trash, making space as if I plan to live in his place. In the basement, a tumultuous sea of books on religion and politics, diary of important influences, foundations of his masterwork uniting two universes, and deep within the fog, his prophet's heart ablaze. It may be that the cost of being born is life itself. It's lovely. Tell me about that poem, Dave.
It's actually the most recent poem. It's in the middle of the book, but it's the last one I've written. And it actually has to do with a very close friend of mine. I met Joel in freshman year of college. We were roommates for 4 years. He was best man at my wedding. You know, he is, and I don't use the word lightly, he is really a brother to me, and he's been very ill over the last 6 months, and he's now in a nursing home. And it doesn't, you know, it doesn't look like he's going to be able to return to his house. So I since he's not married, really doesn't have much family, I drove down to Washington, D.C., where he lives, and kind of was cleaning out his house and having these thoughts. And just, you know, he's one of the finest minds I know. Had a tremendous influence on me, and yet someone who may never be known by the world. So, you know, there was a certain pathos in his aspiration, his gifts on one hand, and the fact that they would seem to be going unrecognized except by a few people who love him on the other hand.
That's really, I think it touches on something there about any of us as artists or any of our listeners, is that it's important to create, it's important to do our work, it's important, as his prophet's heart was ablaze, to do it, whether we are recognized or not. And I think sometimes we assume that in recognition we can influence, and that's true, but we also, he's obviously influenced you. You have an opportunity to influence a lot of other people. So he doesn't necessarily have to be known to a lot of people at all to really make a huge difference.
Because of this miracle of human connection, the way, you know,
exactly.
in a sense, you know, sometimes when I was young, I thought kind of an individualist template, we are who we are, and, you know, it's the self, the individual being, but we all live through connection. It's an I and a thou and many other thous, and, you know, where does the self begin and end? In some sense, it really doesn't. We only are to the extent that we're connected, and yet we're living in a world where, you know, it's, you know, the sort of the marker for creativity or human value is the individual, not to put that down, but the individual isn't whole without those larger and wider connections.
One of my favorite writers when I was a kid was Lillian Hellman, and she wrote very eloquently about her struggle between being alone and being connected, and that she needed to be alone. She was not struggling with her isolation at that point, but I think that sometimes it's a positive experience, sometimes it's a painful experience about the struggle between the sense of it's just me, I'm alone in my suffering, or my achievement has to be mine alone. You know, that I think is two faces of that same kind of alone issue versus how do I share this achievement, or you know, is it even mine?
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. I haven't wanted to because this has been so great, but I didn't know if you wanted to do that second poll or turn everything over to the group, or.
Well, I think we had another poll question, but I think we're going to skip it, and I think what we're going to do, if that's okay, is I'm going to just advance my slides here, and there we are again. Hello, Dave. And so, folks, your turn. Do you have any thoughts or questions about your project? And if you do, any ideas about anything we've been talking about today, about your own artistic project, whatever, you know, maybe what is the artistic medium that you intend to work on? Anything that's come up today, type it into your question box, and Vic will share it with Dave and I, and then we'll think about that. We'll talk about that. So, I haven't had any questions posed so far, but if you do, there's a question box in your control panel, your webinar control panel. Just please type or use the chat function below that to get in touch with me. And I'm going to, well, while we're seeing if folks have anything they'd like to ask us, one of the things that I'd like to mention also, just to continue with that thing, what we're talking about is people tend to think of creativity, Dave, as being confined to art work. And there's a lot of what you do that isn't, you know, what we would think of as art per se. Do you know what I mean? Can you speak to that about being creative, not just in the sense of, you know, poetry or painting or something like that?
Sure. You know, I know back in 1995 when Linda and I began struggling with this whole question about whether my brother might be the notorious Unabomber, I was working at a youth shelter in Albany Equinox Youth Shelter, where, you know, kids who were basically throwaways.
Right.
A lot of people had given up on them, including in most cases their own families had come to stay and try to get their lives turned around. And it was interesting to me because at that point, you know, rap music was really just sort of beginning to take hold, and all of these kids who were, you know, flunking out of school and whatever, they were doing the most creative sort of poetry stuff, and
yeah.
I really enjoyed their play with the language, and I think I learned a lot from them as well. But also at the same time, I began to realize that in trying to help people and trying to do social work, really it's some of the same things that involved in the creative process. And you begin with relationship. I mean, you can't help somebody unless you have a trusting relationship with them.
Correct.
You have to be able to respect the process, too. In other words, you can't just tell people where they need to be. You have to kind of meet them where they are and listen to them and sort of, you know, be part of their process, hopefully a helpful part of their process as they try to think of a way to make meaning and move forward in a positive way.
And I completely resonate with that. I mean, I am a social worker, and I've been very fortunate to have worked in a variety of settings, one being hospice and also being in a locked facility for adjudicated youths. And in all of those instances, both of those instances I could go on, but specifically they come to mind right at this moment, that the capacities that I was talking about earlier, the same capacities I use on the bandstand with other musicians, I used in hospice, and I use in my capacity as working with the girls, with the adolescents, and certainly working with my patients in the work I do today, that it's this same process of, can we be curious about what the issue is that we're thinking about, or the process we're trying to understand, or the suffering we're attempting to address and be with? Can we sit with it? Can we be curious about it? Is it possible for us to take some risks? In that risk-taking, can we innovate? Can we come up with a way to step outside the box? Yeah, I certainly find, go ahead, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And also the realization that sometimes the light bulb goes off and you realize that while you're helping other people, you're actually really helping yourself a lot, that the very relational process of doing social work or extending a helping hand to someone changes you in some way, so that it's very much like working with a material, whether it's paint or words or music, sound. It's in your relationship to that material that you're changing inwardly as well, and that you probably really can't help someone change unless you're open to change yourself, and unless you hold the relationship in a kind of, you cherish it enough, you value it enough, you respect it enough, so that you stake yourself in it to some extent.
One of my dear friends and mentors, a gentleman by the name of John Malecki, actually Father John Malecki, one of the things, we worked on a lot of trauma cases together, and one of the things that I always saw John do, which was lovely, is when, and made sense, and it was real for him, and it was really a big lesson for me as a younger person. Whenever someone came in and talked to him, he didn't think of them as a patient, or he didn't think, it was a person who came in to talk to him, and when they were finished, he would thank them. And he meant it. And he would thank them for taking the risk. And he would thank them for sharing. And he really held it in that regard, that when people share this kind of, this part of their lives, whether it's suffering, whether it's good, but no matter what it is, all of that, as far as he was concerned, was an honor. And it was deafening for me on some level, and in a very positive way. It really made me stop and think, what is it that I'm doing? And so really seeing what people are viewing what people are sharing as being important.
I do have two questions. I'm sorry, didn't want to interrupt, but I want folks to have the opportunity.
Go ahead.
The first one is, how do you stimulate the right brain function that's damaged from the illness to develop a creative process?
Oh, good question. Thanks for that question. Well, that's something actually I was just talking about with a patient the other day. Part of it is, and I hope this is helpful, and maybe you have tried this, and if you have, apologize, but if you haven't, part of it is trying different idioms. I mean, for example, if you were someone who was more apt to use words previously, maybe you could get a sketchbook, get some paints, try to use different parts, different idioms. Paint if you would have written, write if you would have painted. If you can walk, are there some activities that you can do ambulating that you wouldn't have done otherwise? In other words, try to do whatever would have been opposite. Try to do a few things. Here's another thought. In healing the brain, it's often very helpful to utilize different parts of the brain. So, for example, I was working with a elderly woman, a devout Catholic, and she happened to use rosary beads. Not something I particularly know about. And one of the things that I encouraged her to do was to touch the beads, which stimulates one part of the brain, to speak her prayer out loud, and so that her lips would move, which would stimulate another part of the brain, and then to also say it silently in her head. And if she could read her prayer, whatever her prayer was, good as well. The point is, part of healing a brain is encouraging the brain in a particular activity to come at it from different perspectives. If you are a writer, I would encourage you to write longhand. I would encourage you to print. I would encourage you to type. All that uses different parts of the brain, I would encourage you to read it silently to yourself. I would encourage you to read it out loud. And we often find that that helps stimulate different things, gets things rolling a little bit. I'll be curious to get it. Go ahead, Dave.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to interject, too, that one thing that I have used and believe in is meditation,
Yep.
quiet sitting, following the breath. And I think part of what that does is it changes reactivity to responsiveness. I mean, I think when we've been traumatized, there's a kind of reactivity that's energized, and it's hard to break the cycle of that reactivity unless you can kind of create some space from it. And in watching one's thoughts and quieting the mind, I think you open up for yourself the possibility of choices that you don't have when you're just being reactive. And I believe it works probably at that neural level.
Well, there's a lot of science. There's a lot of science to support that meditation is often really healing to the brain. And in fact, what the listener might think about is Google, if you can, or ask someone to Google. There's interesting literature out there about art and meditation, art and reflection, whether it's writing or painting, or kind of putting these two things together. And feel free also to send us an email and let us know what you find. Vic, another question?
Yeah, one other, and you both sort of addressed this peripherally a moment ago, but didn't know if you had any other specific statements, responses. How do we create community from an arts-based medium for heartfelt and honest sharing while keeping people who share safe?
Ooh, I like that. Well, I think hopefully we're doing that today, and that part of what I think that Dave, that all of us have an investment in here today is doing just this. That I think Dave serves as a really beautiful example of someone who's taken monstrous risks and has been intelligent, has been calculated in a smart way, in a thoughtful way, in a kind way about his risk taking, about when he was creating his art, going to safe places to do it and safe people to do it with. And I think having that experience, by extension, we're trying to do that here today. I think Dave learned how to do that, and hopefully I've learned something about how to do that, and that's part of what we hope to do here, is to have that kind of an online community, as well as occasionally, in different conferences where we're going to be places where we create a safe place for people to share.
And I think it's worth pointing out and acknowledging that everybody who is kind of wanting to promote themselves as an artist is going to deal with tons and tons of rejection. So
yeah.
It's kind of like, you're offering a gift to the world, and you have these buyers who say, well, this is not good enough. And
yes.
I think that happens all the time. Remember Van Gogh, what did he sell? One painting in his life, I think.
Right.
So there's some sense in which this process has to have, it has to build from inside into intimacy and then beyond. But I would focus on one's internal space and on the intimacy that you develop with other people working in the medium.
I think that those are very good thoughts. And maybe that's something in a future time we can talk about, is when people do take their work out there, and it does, and responses are sometimes not kind, how to cope with that, how to cope with the rejection and the hurt. And yeah, that's. But in the meantime, we hope to make a safe place for people to take their work and their thoughts. Well, I think we're about that time, and here's something I'd like to, some thoughts I'd like to leave folks with. Persistence and fortitude. So just to the issue we're addressing, a willingness to fail. Every day, I have to be, speaking for myself, willing to fail and fall on my face and make a fool of myself every day. But in doing that, I'm developing self-reliance. And hey, here it is again, the importance of community. When you don't feel you can persevere, you can borrow from the strength of others. And I'd like to think that that's a part of what Dave and I and Vic are doing here today, is creating the safe place for people. And that's a faith in the process. Allow yourself extra time or help to do the more difficult things. Get help to do the more difficult things. And here's one of my favorite, as I understand it, Buddhist phrases: fall down 7 times, you get up 8. Dave, thank you so much for doing this here. I hope you don't mind that I put this up here. I'd like to encourage people to consider getting this wonderful little book. It's a gem. I think you'll enjoy these poems, and I encourage folks to not only read them, but read them out loud. It's really lovely. Our next meeting, we're going to send everybody an invitation by email. Once the registration is open, we'll post it in a few places, but certainly on albanyhealthmanagement.com. And when you get to albanyhealthmanagement.com, if you could click on creativity. And so we hope to see you at our next meeting. For more information, again, just go to albanyhealthmanagement.com. And oops, sorry about that. So I think we're about to end. Dave, thank you so much for doing this.
Really, I always enjoy being in conversation with you.
Okay. And well, thanks everybody. We look forward to seeing, hearing, seeing, emailing from you, texting, whatever. And Vic, thanks. Dave, thanks. Bye-bye. Have a good day.